let's pick it back up with impacts of early humans in chapter 16. So a lot of investigators believe that humans were at least partially responsible for the extinction of a lot of the large mammals, and that we saw a pretty evident pattern over time of species like mammoth and mastodons, the saber-toothed cats, pygmy hippos, dodos, and elephant birds going extinct after humans reached new lands. So scientists noted that Madagascar and several Mediterranean islands show fossil evidence that humans' arrival always was accompanied by the selective extinction of the island's megafauna. There's some recent contradictory evidence from Madagascar showing that humans were actually there much earlier than thought that could put that theory into question. There's another theory that perhaps rather than overhunting the cause of this relationship between early human arrival to mainlands and islands and the loss of the megafauna may have been caused by a pathogen that was introduced from humans to other, particularly mammalian species, that could have spread through populations and decimated populations after humans arrived. So this figure from the book just shows those two waves of mammal extinctions. The first wave between 12 and 13,000 years ago, mostly affecting mainland areas that resulted in the extinction of at least 135 species. And then a second hit thousands of years later in the West Indies and Galapagos. In the West Indies, we found that more than 80% of land mammalian fauna was lost in concert with the arrival of humans. So today, we have what is thought of as the sixth mass extinction underway, and the only one caused by a living species. There are an increasing number of an increasing number of humans, ever increasing, and increasing consumption needed to meet those needs. And it is that consumption that creates conditions that endanger other species. So of course, the number one cause would be human population growth, and all of these other causes are secondary to that primary cause. Some of those are, and we'll go over this more when we talk about species in a wildlife species in a modern world next week. Some of those causes that we know are habitat destruction, loss, fragmentation, exploitation of species in providing fuel and fiber, the spread of invasives with our global trade and movement across the world, pollution in all forms, chemical, light, air, water, and of course now global climate change. There are many endangered species out there, and in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about the concept of endangerment as a policy in the US, but in general, we believe that about 2% of birds, 5% of mammals, 17 of the world's crocodiles and alligators, and all large cats are endangered of becoming extinct. There are a few characteristics that we can point to that we see over and over with species that have become endangered and those that have gone extinct over time. And they are large body size, carnivores, which also require more habitat to meet their needs, specialists who often require specialized habitats or food resources to survive and thrive. And as we mentioned before, have always been at a higher risk of extinction just because of the sheer fact that they are less flexible in meeting their needs. Restricted distribution is really just means habitat specialist. Another interesting one is a perceived threat to humans. So we have seen many of our large carnivores over time actually with bounties on their heads to completely do away with those species, and that's something I think we're seeing today with rattlesnakes being persecuted. Species that breed in colonies or gather in large groups are always more vulnerable because a single event can have a more profound impact on those species. Species that are case selected, and largely because of their low reproductive rate, are more vulnerable. Species that are offer a particular product for human consumption, and that's something we saw and have seen with whale hunting. Species that lack regulation in our take of them, and that's been particularly difficult with species that occupy marine habitats. And then other species that aren't as well adapted to today's world. And I think it's worth noting that over time, even before humans were on Earth, there were species and extinction events that occurred with organisms that were less adapted to the changing world and were replaced by more adaptive organisms. So some of the extinct birds out there since 1500, we know of at least 129 avian species that have gone extinct. Often this has been because of habitat loss and degradation, introduction of invasive species, especially for island endemics, has been particularly troubling. When I worked in Hawaii, the introduction of mammalian predators there, along with avian malaria, with the introduction of mosquitoes, was decimating those island bird populations. And then, of course, overexploitation of birds for food, feathers, or the pet trade, or persecution of birds as pests, which was the case with the Carolina parakeet. The ivory-billed woodpecker offers a pretty tragic story of extinction. We knew, really by the early 1900s, we had managed to clear a lot of the old growth bottomland hardwood forests that occupied the entire Mississippi alluvial valley and the southeastern Atlantic coast as well. So that sort of simultaneous wholesale destruction of that old growth forest type that the ivory-billed woodpecker depended on really restricted ivory-billed's range over a relatively short period of time. What's interesting and what a lot of people don't know is that prior to the bottomland hardwood forest being lost, ivory-bills occupied upland old growth habitats as well. But they had been relegated to that bottomland hardwood forest because that was the last old growth to go in the eastern part of the United States. Ivory-bills were considered extinct in the 1920s when a pair turned up in Florida, and that pair was shot as specimens. Classic museum specimen collection back in the day. And then in 1938, they estimated that there were about 20 individuals remaining in the wild. Um, in the late 1930s, a population in Arkansas was identified on a timber-owned company of the Singer, what was known as the Singer tract from, I believe, the Singer sewing machine company back in the day. And at that time, people were aware that these were some of the last of these species remaining. And so, despite requests from 4 Southern governors and from the National Audubon Society, the last ivory-billed woodpecker tract, that Singer tract, was clear cut in the 1930s. I've got a link to some audio and video that was taken at that time of some of the last remaining ivory-billed woodpeckers out there. So by 1944, the last known ivory-billed woodpecker, a female, was gone from that cutover tract. I was around and working for the Nature Conservancy in 2007 when it was believed that an ivory-billed woodpecker had been spotted in Arkansas. And it was like someone had found Elvis. It was such a big deal in the ornithological world. And it was actually in South Carolina. The Nature Conservancy of South Carolina led that statewide effort to search for ivory-billed woodpeckers in some of the last remaining old growth forests that were in South Carolina. And there were similar search efforts going on in Georgia and Florida and Arkansas and other states where there had been continued sightings of ivory-bills. And at this point, the bird remains on the endangered species list as possibly still extant, but I think a lot of people have given up hope that ivory-billed woodpeckers are going to be found at this point. The story of the passenger pigeon extinction is one of the most tragic in that these birds were once considered the most numerous bird in North America. So the passenger pigeon, or also known as the wild pigeon, lived in enormous migratory flocks. Sometimes those flocks contain more than 2 billion birds, and during migration, flocks could stretch out over miles. And one flock was recorded as being a mile in width and 300 miles long across the sky, sometimes taking hours and hours to pass through an area. So some estimate that there were 3 billion to 5 billion passenger pigeons in the United States when Europeans arrived in North America. Others argue that the species had not been as common in the pre-Columbian period, but that their numbers actually grew alongside European occupation of this area. So this species went from being one of the most abundant birds in the world during the 19th century to extinction in the early 20th century. And at that time, passenger pigeons had one of the largest groups or flocks of any animal, second only to the Rocky Mountain locust. Some of the reductions in numbers occurred because of habitat loss when Europeans started settling further inland. The primary factor emerged when pigeon meat was actually commercialized as a cheap food, a food that was offered to slaves at that time and also to the poor. This resulted in hunting of pigeons on just a massive scale. So there was a slow decline in the numbers between 1800 and 1870, followed by a catastrophic decline between 1870 and 1890. And the last passenger pigeon, Martha, as pictured here, died in September of 1914 at the Cincinnati Zoo. Another thought they have is that there was actually a reproductive biological factor at play at the end with passenger pigeons, something that is referred to as the darling effect. And what that researcher had proposed was that passenger pigeons were not able to move into breeding condition unless they were in sort of the loud, raucous colonial groups that normally nested together. And so once a critical mass of birds had been lost, their reproductive ecology was thrown off, and there was a quick decline of remaining birds. Hope I'm not depressing you guys too much. Another significant decline that we've seen is the recent decline in amphibian species. Per the IUCN Red List, there are about 486 amphibian species known to be critically endangered. Most species having sort of unexplained declines are from 3 different families. And ecologically, these species are found in forests and streams and montane habitats. One of the most significant theories is thought to be the citrus fungus, which attacks the tissues and the keratin and mouth parts and the skin of salamanders. It's deadly to frogs, producing a toxin that interferes with the skin's ability to respire and osmoregulate. Some of the first found declining populations were in Australia and Panama, and we have since seen these massive declines from the fungus in the US and Costa Rica and Africa. So really has been global in recent decades. And that fungus thrives in cool and moist environments. Some researchers feel like this is a fungus that amphibians have cohabitated with for a long time, and that there are probably secondary factors at play, which are making amphibians more vulnerable, weakening their immune system, or otherwise stressing the organism so that they succumb to the fungus. So why do we preserve species biodiversity? There are a lot of arguments out there that folks use to make the case for preserving biodiversity, and you will come across these in your career, no doubt. The aesthetic argument, of course, dates back to some of our earliest writers and thinkers discussing the fact that nature is a source of beauty, of joy, of interest and recreation for people. There's the ethical moral argument that all living things have the intrinsic right to exist despite their usefulness to humans. There is an ecological argument that the loss of one species can start, of course, the ecological unraveling of entire systems. And of course, humans are part of that system. And finally, the economic argument, which I hear a lot in my line of work, that relies on the value of species to humans, that animals and plants are an essential source of food, fiber, and medicine, and that it is in our interest to preserve that biodiversity for future use for humans. And this relates also to the concept of ecosystem services, that organisms perform essential roles and that nature itself has provisioning services that are useful for humans. For example, being pollination that invertebrates do, and some vertebrates do. And then I've got a few review questions for you guys, and we'll pick this back up. with a environmental legislation lecture next.